Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they have a way of finding you when you least expect it. At 67, Evelyn Matthews thought her past was safely locked away until she walked into room 314 that Tuesday morning. She had been a nurse for 40 years and knew what proper bandages looked like, but this patient's dressings were different, too tight, too neat. His hands shook too much to wrap them that way. When she peeled back the gauze, she found names carved into his skin. Names from her small town, names of people both alive and dead, names that took her back 50 years to a terrible night she had tried to forget. 3 people knew what happened. That summer, 2 were supposed to be dead, so how did this stranger know their secret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Mercy General Hospital, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floors that Evelyn Matthews had walked for more years than she cared to count. At 67, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 4 decades learning every corner, every sound, every rhythm of this place. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she had worn since her 20s, and pinned to her crisp white uniform was a small gold pin marking 40 years of service, a badge of honor that felt more like a shield against the world. Beyond these walls, Evelyn had always found comfort in the predictable chaos of hospital life. The steady beep of monitors, the soft shuffle of sensible shoes on tile, the quiet conversations between colleagues who had become more like family than her actual relatives back in Cedar Falls. She had built her entire adult life around this routine, this purpose, this safe distance from the small town where she grew up, and the memories that lived there like ghosts in an abandoned house. The third-floor medical ward was her domain. She knew every patient's medication schedule, every doctor's preferences, every quirk of the aging building's temperamental heating system. Room 314 had been occupied for 3 weeks now by a patient the night staff had started calling John Doe, though Evelyn suspected that wasn't his real name. He was perhaps in his early 70s, with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to hold decades of unspoken stories. His admission paperwork was sparse, found unconscious near the interstate with no identification, no family contacts, no insurance. Just an elderly man with mysterious injuries and a silence that felt deliberate rather than confused. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, was a woman half Evelyn's age, but twice as intense. She had graduated top of her class from Northwestern and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed medicine could solve any problem if you just applied enough science and determination. Sarah reminded Evelyn of herself at that age, before life had taught her that some wounds never fully heal, no matter how skilled the treatment. "Morning, Evelyn," Dr. Chen called out as she emerged from room 312, tablet in hand. "How's our mystery patient today?" "Stable," Evelyn replied, the word that had become her standard response about John Doe. "Vitals are good. He ate some breakfast." "Still not talking much." "I've been thinking we should contact social services," Sarah said, lowering her voice. 3 weeks with no identification, no one looking for him. It's unusual." Evelyn nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the suggestion. She couldn't explain why, but the idea of involving more people in John Doe's case made her uncomfortable. There was something about his quiet presence that felt familiar, though she was certain they had never met. Marcus Rodriguez worked the night shift and had been at Mercy General almost as long as Evelyn. He was one of the few people who remembered when she first started, young and eager and running from something she never talked about. Over the years, he had learned not to ask about her past, just as she had learned not to pry into why he chose to work nights and sleep through the daylight hours. "Strange thing about the old man in 314, Marcus had mentioned during shift change last week. "Sometimes I catch him staring out the window like he's waiting for someone. And his hands, they shake when he tries to hold a cup. But when I was Helping him with his bandages, they were steady as a surgeon's. The observation had stuck with Evelyn, though she hadn't been sure why at the time. Now, standing outside room 314 with her morning medication cart, she felt that familiar tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her age or the 3 flights of stairs she climbed every day. Her apartment was a 15-minute drive from the hospital, in a quiet complex where most of her neighbors were also retirees who valued privacy and well-maintained gardens. She had lived there for 12 years, ever since her mother's death had finally severed the last thread connecting her to Cedar Falls. The apartment was neat and comfortable, decorated with landscape prints and a few photographs of colleagues from various hospital Christmas parties. There were no family photos, no mementos from her childhood, no evidence of the first 22 years of her life. In her bedroom closet, behind a box of winter sweaters she rarely needed in the mild climate, was a small jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside, beneath a few pairs of earrings and a watch that had stopped working years ago, was a folded piece of newspaper that had yellowed with age. Evelyn had not looked at it in over a decade, but she knew every word by heart. Sometimes late, at night when sleep eluded her, she could recite the headline from memory: 2 Cedar Falls teens die in tragic accident. The routine of her days had become a kind of meditation. Wake at 5:30, coffee and toast while listening to the local news, arrive at the hospital by 7 for shift change, check on her assigned patients, distribute medications, update charts, coordinate with doctors and families, lunch in the staff cafeteria with Sarah and Marcus when their schedules aligned. Afternoon rounds, more medications, more charts. Home by 4, a simple dinner, an hour of reading, and bed by 9:30. It was a life that worked, a life that kept her busy enough not to think too much about what she had left behind. But room 314 was disrupting that careful balance. John Doe's presence felt like a crack in the dam she had built around her memories. His eyes seemed to follow her movements with an intelligence that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. And there was something about the way he looked at her specifically, not with the general gratitude of a patient toward their caregiver, but with a recognition that made her skin prickle with unease. The bandages around his forearms were changed daily, covering what the intake notes described as lacerations of unknown origin. The wounds were healing well, but their pattern had always struck Evelyn as odd, too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be the result of a fall or struggle. When she had first seen them, still fresh and angry red, she had wondered if they might be self-inflicted. But now, 3 weeks later, she was beginning to suspect something else entirely. Cedar Falls was a 4-hour drive north, through farmland and small towns that all looked like variations on the same theme. Evelyn had not made that drive in 20 years, not since her mother's funeral, and before that not for another 15 years. She had built her adult life on the principle that some places were better left in the past, some memories better left undisturbed. The girl who had grown up in Cedar Falls, who had walked those tree-lined streets and swum in Miller's Pond and graduated from the high school with the faded brick facade, felt like someone else entirely. Someone young and foolish and guilty of cowardice that had shaped every decision since. As she stood outside room 314 that Tuesday morning, medication cup in one hand and patient chart in the other, Evelyn felt the weight of all those years of careful avoidance. Something was shifting, some long-dormant current was stirring, and she had the unsettling feeling that her carefully constructed life was about to be turned upside down by whatever lay beneath those precisely wrapped bandages. The doctor was slightly ajar, and she could see John Doe sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the parking lot below. His profile was sharp against the morning light, and for just a moment, something about the angle of his jaw and the set of his shoulders reminded her of someone she had once known, someone from a time when she was still young enough to believe. That courage was something you either had or didn't, rather than something you had to choose again and again, every day, for the rest of your life. Evelyn knocked softly on the doorframe before entering room 314. John Doe turned from the window, and for the first time since his arrival, he looked directly into her eyes. The intensity of his gaze made her pause halfway through the doorway. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Time for your medication." He nodded but didn't speak. That wasn't unusual. Many patients went through periods of selective silence, especially those dealing with trauma. But as she approached his bedside, she noticed something that made her stop short. The bandages on his forearms had been rewrapped overnight, but not by any nurse she knew. The gauze was wound with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial, each layer perfectly aligned with the next. "Who changed your bandages?" she asked, setting down the medication cup. His eyes flickered with something: surprise, fear, recognition. Before she could determine which, he looked away toward the window. "Again. The night nurse said they were fine yesterday," Evelyn continued, her curiosity overriding her usual professional boundaries. "These look fresh." When he remained silent, she made a decision that would later feel like the moment her carefully constructed world began to crumble. She reached for the edge of the gauze on his left arm. "Let me just check that the wound is healing properly," she said. His hand shot out faster than someone with his apparent frailty should have been able to move, grasping her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, and his eyes locked onto hers, with an urgency that made her breath catch. "Please," he whispered, the first word she had heard him speak. "Don't." But Evelyn had been a nurse for 4 decades. She had seen every kind of wound, every form of self-harm, every variety of human suffering that could be hidden beneath bandages. Something about his desperation only strengthened her resolve. "I'm here to help," she said gently, prying his fingers. And from her wrist, "Let me see." She began to unwrap the gauze, each layer revealing more of what lay beneath. The wound had healed significantly since his admission, but as the final layer came away, Evelyn's hands began to shake. Carved into the pale skin of his forearm, with the deliberate precision of someone who had taken their time, were names. Not random scratches or self-inflicted cuts, but carefully etched letters that spelled out words she had not seen or spoken. "In 50 years, Maria Santos." Below that, in slightly smaller letters, "Tommy Chen," and below that in letters that seemed to burn themselves into her vision, "Evelyn Matthews." The medication cup slipped from her other hand, clattering to the floor, and scattering pills across the linoleum. Evelyn stepped backward, her mind reeling as decades of carefully suppressed memories came flooding back. Maria Santos, Tommy Chen. The 3 of them, inseparable throughout high school, planning to change the world together, until that night. In July 1973, when everything went wrong. "How do you know those names?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. John Doe was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not triumph, not malice, but something closer to profound sadness. He extended his right arm and with trembling fingers began to unwrap those bandages as well. More names, more dates. Some she recognized from Cedar Falls, people who had lived there when she was young. Some still alive, others long dead. But there were other names too, names she didn't recognize, arranged in what appeared to be some kind of pattern or code. "I don't understand," Evelyn said, though part of her was beginning to, and that understanding filled her with a terror she hadn't felt in decades. The patient reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out a small, yellowed piece of newspaper. He held it out to her with hands that no longer shook. Evelyn knew what it was, before she took it. The same article she kept hidden in her jewelry box at home, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn thin. 2 Cedar Falls. Teens die in tragic accident, but this copy was different. Someone had circled certain words in faded ink, creating a message she had never noticed before. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice stronger now, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, Slowly, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of years and loss, and a patience that seemed almost infinite. Someone who's been waiting a very long time for you to come back. Evelyn left work early that day, claiming a sudden illness that wasn't entirely untrue. She drove home in a daze, her mind churning with questions and fears and memories she had spent decades trying to forget. In her apartment, she went straight to the bedroom closet and retrieved the jewelry box, her hands shaking as she opened it and pulled out her own copy of the newspaper article. She spread it on her kitchen table next to the copy John Doe had given her and studied them both under the bright overhead light. The circled words on his copy formed a message. 3 new, 2 died, 1 remains. The summer of 1973 came back to her in fragments. She was 22 then, fresh out of nursing school and working at the Cedar Falls Clinic. Maria Santos was her best friend since childhood. Tommy Chen, the boy, they had both loved in different ways. They had been inseparable, the three of them, bound together by shared dreams and secrets, and the kind of intense loyalty that only exists among the young, until the night they witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Evelyn's phone rang, startling her out of her reverie. She almost didn't answer. Very few people had her number, and she rarely received calls after business hours, but something compelled her to pick up. Evelyn Matthews? The voice was male, older, with a slight accent she couldn't place. Yes, who is this? My name is Miguel Santos. I think you knew my sister. The phone nearly slipped from Evelyn's grip. Miguel Santos, Maria's little brother, who would have been maybe 10 years old the last time she saw him, which meant he was now nearly 60, probably with children and grandchildren of his own. Miguel, she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so many years. How did you find me? It wasn't easy, he said. You've done a good job of staying hidden, but people have been asking questions lately, questions about that summer, about what really happened to Maria and Tommy. I don't know what you mean, Evelyn said automatically, the lie coming as easily as it had for 50 years. There's a man in your hospital, Miguel continued as if she hadn't spoken. He's been asking about you, about all of us. I think it's time we talked. The line went quiet, except for the sound of both of them breathing. Evelyn stared at the newspaper articles spread across her table, at the names carved into John Doe's arms, at the life she had built on the foundation of a single moment of cowardice. Evelyn, Miguel said softly, my sister died believing you would eventually tell the truth. I've spent 40 years hoping she was right. After he hung up, Evelyn sat in her kitchen as the evening light faded outside her windows. She thought about the girl she had been, full of righteous anger and determination to make the world a better place. She thought about the woman she had become, dedicated to healing others while never quite healing herself. And she thought about the patient in room 314, whose presence had somehow managed to crack open the past she had sealed away. 3 people knew what happened that summer. 2 were supposed to be dead, but what if they weren't the only ones who knew? What if someone else had been watching, waiting, keeping track of the survivors all these years? As darkness settled over her apartment, Evelyn realized that her carefully constructed life of anonymity and avoidance was over. The past had found her at last, and this time she might not be able to run away. The drive to Cedar Falls took 4 hours. 4 hours of watching familiar landscapes roll past her windshield like scenes from a half-remembered dream. Evelyn had made the trip reluctantly, after 3 more phone calls from Miguel Santos, each, one more insistent than the last. He wasn't threatening exactly, but there was an urgency in his voice that suggested time was running out for something, though he wouldn't say what. She had called in sick to work, something she had done perhaps 5 times in 40 years. Dr. Chen had sounded concerned, offering to check on her, but Evelyn had declined. How could she explain that she was driving toward a confrontation with a past she had spent half a century trying to escape? Cedar Falls looked smaller than she remembered, the way childhood places always do when revisited through adult eyes. The main street was still lined with the same brick buildings, though many of the shops had changed hands multiple times. Morrison's Five and Dime was now an antique store. The movie theater, where she and Maria and Tommy had spent countless Saturday afternoons showing double features, was boarded up, its marquee dark and missing letters. She drove slowly through the residential neighborhoods, past houses that triggered flashes of memory. The blue Victorian where Mrs. Henderson used to give piano lessons, the corner house with the wraparound porch where the Kellys had raised 6 children and always had room for one more at their dinner table. The modest ranch house where she had grown up, now painted a different color, with different cars in the driveway and different lives unfolding inside. Her first stop was the cemetery. Cedar Falls Memorial was on a hill overlooking the town, shaded by old oak trees that had grown taller and fuller in the decades since she had last been here. She parked near the main gate and walked slowly through the rows of headstones, reading names and dates that told the story of a small town's history. She found them in the newer section, side by side as they had been in life. Maria Santos, 1951-1973. Thomas Chen, 1951-1973. Their headstones were simple granite markers, but someone had been caring for the graves. Fresh flowers, yellow roses for Maria, white carnations for Tommy, had been placed recently. The grass was neatly trimmed, and small solar lights had been installed to illuminate the stones after dark. Evelyn knelt between the graves, her knees protesting against the damp earth. She had not cried for her friends in decades, but looking at their names carved in stone, she felt the tears coming whether she wanted them or not. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the wind and the trees and the silence. "I've been sorry every day. For 50 years, a voice behind her made her jump. "I hoped you would come here first." She turned to see a man in his late 50s, tall and lean, with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded her painfully of Maria. Miguel Santos had grown into his father's strong features, but had inherited his sister's gentle expression. "Father, Santos, actually," he said, noting her surprised look. "I've been the parish priest here for 20 years. Evelyn struggled to her feet, brushing dirt from her knees. "Miguel, you look like Maria," he finished. "People tell me that often. It used to make me sad, but now I consider it a blessing." They stood together in the quiet cemetery, 2 people connected by tragedy and loss, and the weight of unfinished business. "You've been taking care of their graves," Evelyn said. "Someone should. Their parents are both gone now. Maria never married, obviously. Tommy's family moved away not long after the funeral. I'm probably the only person left in town who remembers them as they really were." "What do you mean?" Miguel's expression grew troubled. "The official story has become the only story for most people. 2 teenagers driving too fast on a rainy night, lost control, crashed into Miller's Creek. Tragic but simple. But you and I both know it wasn't that simple." Evelyn felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Miguel, I don't think I'm the right person to—" "You're the only person," he said firmly. "You're the only one left who knows what really happened that night." He gestured toward a bench near the cemetery's entrance. They walked over and sat down, the late afternoon sun filtering through the oak leaves above them. "I need to show you something," Miguel said, pulling a small book from his jacket pocket. It was an old diary, the kind teenage girls used to keep, with a tiny lock that had long since been broken. "Maria's?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. "I found it last month when I was cleaning out my parents' house. They had kept her room exactly as she left it for 30 years before they finally sealed it up. This was hidden under her mattress." With trembling hands, Evelyn opened the diary to a page Miguel had marked with a torn piece of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Maria's, the same careful script she had used for school assignments and love letters and the notes they used to pass in chemistry class. "July 15th, 1973, Evelyn read aloud. "We saw something tonight that we weren't supposed to see, something terrible. Tommy wants to go to the police right away, but Evelyn thinks we should wait, think it through. I don't know what's right. All I know is that someone is going to have to pay for what happened to that family." Evelyn's vision blurred as she read her own name in her dead friend's handwriting. She flipped through more pages, finding entries that detailed their discussions, their arguments, their growing certainty that they had to act. July 20th, 1973. Evelyn is scared. "I understand why. What we saw could destroy a lot of important people. But Tommy is right. We can't just pretend it didn't happen. Some things are more important than being safe." July 22nd, 1973. "Tomorrow, we're going to Sheriff Kane's office, all three of us." Evelyn finally agreed. She said she couldn't live with herself if we didn't tell the truth. I'm proud of her. I'm proud of all of us. But Evelyn remembered July 23rd differently. She remembered waking up that morning in a cold sweat, imagining all the ways their plan could go wrong. She remembered calling Maria and Tommy separately, begging them to wait just one more day, to think it through one more time. She remembered the disappointment in their voices when she finally admitted she couldn't go through with it. They went. "Without me," she said quietly, closing the diary. "I know," Miguel said. "The accident happened that afternoon while they were driving back from the sheriff's office." "What did they tell Sheriff Kane?" "That's what I've been trying to find out for 20 years. Kane died 5 years ago, never spoke about it. But there are people still alive who might know. People who might be willing to talk, now that enough time has passed." Evelyn looked across the cemetery toward the town below, where lights were beginning to twinkle in windows as families gathered for dinner. Somewhere down there were the answers to questions she had been afraid to ask for half a century. "The man in the hospital," she said. "The one with the names carved in his arms. You know who he is." Miguel nodded. "I have suspicions, but I think you need to see something else first." He stood up and offered her his hand. "There's someone you need to meet, someone who's been waiting almost as long as I have for you to come home." The Santos family home sat on Elm Street, a modest 2-story house with white siding and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of decades. Evelyn remembered visiting here countless times as a teenager, when Mrs. Santos would insist on feeding anyone who walked through her door, and Mr. Santos would argue politics with whoever was willing to listen. The house looked smaller now, weathered by time and the absence of the large, boisterous family that had once filled it with laughter and Spanish and the smell of fresh tortillas. Miguel led her up the front steps, past flower pots filled with marigolds that reminded Evelyn painfully of Maria's favorite flowers. Inside, the house was quiet and clean, filled with the kind of careful preservation that spoke of a man living alone among memories. "I kept most of Maria's things," Miguel explained as they climbed the narrow staircase. "My parents couldn't bear to get rid of them, and after they passed I couldn't either." Maria's room was like stepping back in time. The twin bed was still covered with the same yellow quilt, the walls still decorated with posters of musicians and movies from the early 70s. A small desk sat beneath the window, and Evelyn could picture Maria sitting there, bent over homework, or writing in her diary by the light of the bedside lamp. "I found something else," Miguel said, opening the closet door. "Something I think you need to see." He pulled out a cardboard box that had been hidden behind hanging clothes. Inside were more diaries, letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings that painted a picture of 3 young people who had believed they could change the world. But at the bottom of the box was something that made Evelyn's blood run cold. A manila envelope marked "Evidence" in Maria's careful handwriting. "Open it," Miguel said softly. Inside were photographs, black and white, slightly blurry, taken from a distance with what must have been an inexpensive camera. But the images were clear enough to show a car accident scene, emergency vehicles, and something else that made Evelyn sink onto Maria's old bed. Bodies being moved. Not 2 bodies as the official report had stated, but 3. "My God," Evelyn whispered, studying the photographs more closely. "There was a 3rd person in the car." "Look at the next one," Miguel said. The second photograph showed a man in a sheriff's uniform directing the scene. Even after 50 years, Evelyn recognized Douglas Kane, who had been a young deputy back then, but had eventually become sheriff. Himself. He was pointing towards something outside the frame of the picture, giving orders to other officers. The third photograph was the most damning. It showed a second car, partially hidden behind the emergency vehicles. A car that hadn't been mentioned in any of the official reports. A car with a distinctive dent in the front bumper and what appeared to be damage to the headlight. Maria. "Who took these?" Miguel said. "She and Tommy must have driven back to the accident scene after they talked to Kane. Maybe they were having second thoughts, or maybe they wanted to document what they had seen, but they were there when it happened." Evelyn's hands shook as she examined the photographs. "This proves the accident wasn't an accident. Someone forced them off the road." "It proves more than that," Miguel said grimly. "Look at the timestamp on the camera." Evelyn squinted at the small numbers printed in the corner of each photograph. The accident had officially occurred at 3:47 p.m. on July 23, 1973. But according to the camera, these pictures were taken at 3:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the crash. "They were still alive when these pictures were taken," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Miguel nodded. "Which means someone at that scene knew they were alive and chose not to help them, or worse. Why didn't Maria develop these? Why didn't she show them to anyone? I think she tried to. Look at this." He handed her a letter that had been folded and refolded many times. It was addressed to the state police, dated July 25, 1973, 2 days after the accident. In it, Maria detailed everything they had witnessed, everything they had told Sheriff Kane, and everything that had happened afterward. She mentioned the photographs and offered to provide them as evidence, but the letter had never been sent. Instead, someone had written across the top in red ink, "They know you have these. Get out of town now." Someone warned her, Evelyn said. Someone knew she had evidence and told her to run, but she didn't run. She and Tommy died that same day. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old clock on Maria's dresser. Evelyn stared at the photographs, at the evidence of a cover-up that had cost her friends their lives, and had shaped every decision she had made for the past 50 years. "Who else knew about this?" she asked. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. The warning note isn't in Maria's handwriting or Tommy's. Someone else wrote it. Someone who knew what they had discovered and tried to save them." Miguel walked to the window and looked out at the street below. "There's something else. The man in your hospital, I think I know who he is. Tell me." "His name is David Chen, Tommy's younger brother. He was only 8 when Tommy died, but he never believed the official story. He spent his adult life investigating what really happened." Evelyn felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The names carved in his arms, a memorial to all the people who have been silenced over the years, not just Maria and Tommy, but others who got too close to the truth. How many others? Miguel's expression was grim. "More than you might think. Cedar Falls has always been a small town, but it's had an unusually high number of unexplained accidents and disappearances over the past 50 years. People who asked the wrong questions or looked too closely at the wrong things." Evelyn thought about the patient she had been caring for, the man who had somehow managed to get himself admitted to her hospital with evidence carved into his own skin. "What does he want from me?" "The same thing I want. The same thing Maria and Tommy wanted 50 years ago. The truth. And what if the truth gets us all killed?" Miguel turned from the window to face her. "Then at least we'll die with clear consciences, which is more than we can say for the people who have been covering this up all these years." As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Evelyn sat in Maria's childhood room, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped her entire adult life. She thought about the girl she had been, so full of courage and conviction, and the woman she had become, hiding behind a professional identity and a carefully constructed distance from the past. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether she was finally ready to face the truth that had been waiting for her all these years. Evelyn drove back to the hospital the next morning with Maria's photographs hidden in her purse and a determination she hadn't felt in decades burning in her chest. The 4-hour journey had given her time to think, to process what she had learned, and to prepare for whatever confrontation awaited her in room 314. The morning shift was already underway when she arrived. Dr. Chen looked surprised to see her. Evelyn had called in sick for 2 days, something unprecedented in her long career. Feeling better? Sarah asked, studying Evelyn's face with the sharp attention of someone trained to notice changes in condition. Much better, Evelyn replied, though she wasn't sure that was entirely true. She felt different, awakened from a long sleep, but whether that counted as better remained to be seen. Your patient in 314 was asking about you yesterday, Sarah continued. First time he's shown interest in anything since he arrived. Marcus said he seemed agitated when you weren't here for morning rounds. Evelyn nodded, her pulse quickening. David Chen, she thought of him by his real name now, had been waiting for her return. The question was what he planned to do next. She made her regular rounds first, checking on her other patients, distributing medications, updating charts. But her mind was focused entirely on room 314 and the conversation she knew was coming. When she finally approached his door, she found him sitting up in bed, fully alert and watching for her. "Hello, David," she said as she entered the room. His eyes widened slightly at the use of his real name, but he didn't seem surprised. "You've been to Cedar Falls. I've been to see Miguel Santos. I've seen Maria's photographs." David Chen studied her face for a long moment. At 71, he was 8 years older than she was, but the years had been harder on him. His face was deeply lined, his hair completely white, and there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke of decades spent carrying a burden too heavy for one person. "Then you know why I'm here," he said. "I know you think I have answers. But David, I ran away from this 50 years ago. I don't know any more than what Maria wrote in her diary. You know more than you think you do." He gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Please, sit. Let me tell you what I've learned." Evelyn sat down, her purse clutched in her lap. Through the thin fabric, she could feel the manila envelope containing Maria's photographs. "I was 8 when Tommy died," David began. "Old enough to know that the official story didn't make sense, but too young for anyone to take my questions seriously. Tommy was the most careful driver I knew. He had taught me to ride a bicycle by making me practice in an empty parking lot for weeks until I could go in a straight line without wobbling. He would never have driven recklessly, especially not with Maria in the car. But accidents happen. This wasn't an accident." David's voice was quiet but firm. "I've spent 40 years investigating what really happened that day. Do you know what I found?" Evelyn shook her head, though she suspected she was about to learn things that would make it impossible to go back to her carefully constructed ignorance. "I found that Sheriff Kane destroyed evidence. I found that the car Tommy was driving had been tampered with. The brake lines had been cut. I found that there were witnesses to the crash who were never interviewed, and that at least one of them died in a similar accident 6 months later." "How do you know all this?" David smiled sadly. "Because I became a private investigator. Spent 30 years of my life tracking down cold cases, learning how to read between the lines of official reports, developing contacts in law enforcement who were willing to look at old evidence with fresh eyes." He reached into his bedside table and pulled out a thick folder. "Would you like to see what 40 years of investigation looks like?" The folder contained dozens of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. Police reports that had been altered, witness statements that had been suppressed, medical examiners' findings that raised more questions than they answered. The night Tommy and Maria died, they weren't the only ones who suffered mysterious accidents, David continued. A farmhand named Joe Morrison was found dead in his barn, supposedly kicked by a horse. A waitress named Linda Kelly disappeared on her way home from work and was never found. Both had been asking questions about something they claimed to have. Seen on the highway that day, Evelyn's blood ran cold as she remembered Linda Kelly, a sweet girl who had served them coffee countless times at the diner where teenagers gathered after school. "Someone was cleaning up loose ends," she said. "Someone with enough power to influence the sheriff's department, the medical examiner's office, and the local newspaper. Someone who could make people disappear and make questions go away. But why didn't they come after me?" David's expression grew thoughtful. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. You were the third member of your group, the one who supposedly backed out at the last minute. But maybe that's exactly why you survived. Maybe they thought you were too scared to ever talk." "They were right," Evelyn said quietly. "I was terrified. I am terrified. But you're here now. That tells me something has changed." Before Evelyn could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Marcus Rodriguez peered in, looking uncertain. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but Evelyn, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." "Who is it?" "Older gentleman. Says his name is Douglas Kane. Claims he used to be sheriff in some town up north." The folder slipped from Evelyn's hands, scattering papers across the floor. David Chen's face went pale, and his monitors began beeping as his heart rate spiked. "Tell him I'm not available," Evelyn said quickly, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "He's not asking to see you officially. He's waiting in the parking lot. Says he just wants to talk. Says it's about some old friends of yours." David grabbed Evelyn's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go," he whispered urgently. "You don't understand what he's capable of." But even as he spoke, Evelyn was looking out the window toward the parking lot. She could see a figure standing beside a dark sedan, an elderly man in a hat and coat despite the warm weather. After 50 years, Douglas Kane had found her. "He knows I'm here," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "which means he probably knows about you too, David, and about Miguel, and about Maria's photographs." "Then we're all in danger." Evelyn stood up, her decision made. Maybe it's time this finally ended. She looked down at David Chen, this man who had spent his entire adult life seeking justice for his murdered brother. "How long have you been planning this confrontation?" "Every day since I was 8 years old." "Then let's finish it." The parking lot felt like a stage set for a confrontation 50 years in the making. Douglas Kane stood beside his dark sedan, no longer the young deputy Evelyn remembered, but an elderly man whose posture still carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were the same cold blue she remembered from that terrible summer. Evelyn walked toward him slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she could feel David Chen watching from his hospital window, and she knew that Marcus and probably Dr. Chen were also observing this strange meeting with growing concern. "Evelyn Matthews," Kane said as she approached. His voice was raspier than she remembered, roughened by age, and what she suspected were decades of cigarettes. "You look good. The years have been kind to you." "I can't say the same for you, Douglas." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Direct as always. I liked that about you, even back then. It made you predictable. What do you want?" "I want to have a conversation about old times, about mutual friends, about secrets that are better left buried." He gestured toward his car. "Why don't we take a drive, for old time's sake?" "I'm not going anywhere with you." Kane's smile faded. "I'm not asking, Evelyn. I'm telling you, get in the car. And if I refuse, then I'll have to report to hospital security that I've identified their mystery patient in room 314. Amazing how many outstanding warrants can be discovered when you know where to look. Amazing how quickly a man can be transferred to a less comfortable facility when he's considered a flight risk." The threat was clear, and Evelyn felt the familiar terror that had kept her silent for 50 years. But something had changed during her visit to Cedar Falls, during her conversation with Miguel and her time in Maria's preserved bedroom. The fear was still there, but it was no longer stronger than her need for answers. 5 minutes, she said. "We talk here in the parking lot where people can see us," Kane considered this, then nodded. 5 minutes should be enough. They moved to a bench near the hospital's main entrance, where the afternoon foot traffic would provide both witnesses and cover for their conversation. Kane settled beside her with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been reminded too many times of his mortality. "You've been busy lately," he said. "Visiting old friends in Cedar Falls, asking questions, looking at things you shouldn't be looking at. Miguel Santos is a priest. He's allowed to have visitors. Miguel Santos is a troublemaker who never learned to let sleeping dogs lie, just like his sister." The casual cruelty in his voice when he mentioned Maria made Evelyn's hands clench into fists. Maria was a good person. She was trying to do the right thing. Maria was a naive girl who thought the world was simple, black and white, right and wrong. She never understood that sometimes people have to make hard choices to protect the greater good. Is that what you call it? The greater good? Kane turned to study her face. "You really don't understand, do you? Even after all these years, you still don't see the bigger picture." "Then explain it to me." For a long moment, Kane was quiet, watching the people who walked past them, hospital staff heading home after their shifts, visitors carrying flowers and worried expressions, the ordinary rhythm of a place where life and death decisions were made every day. "July 1973, he said finally. "You 3 kids witnessed a hit-and-run accident. Driver fled the scene, left a family to die. You came to me with this information, full of righteous anger and teenage certainty that justice would be served. That's exactly what happened." "No, Evelyn, that's what you think happened. What really happened was that you witnessed something that could have destroyed this entire community." The driver wasn't some random criminal. He was Judge Harrison Wells, a man whose decisions affected the lives of thousands of people, a man whose reputation was the foundation of the justice system in 3 counties. Evelyn felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "You protected him because he was important. I protected him because losing him would have done more harm than good." Wells was 65 years old, facing early-stage dementia. He had maybe 2 good years left, and those years were crucial for the cases he was overseeing. Major drug prosecutions, environmental lawsuits against companies that were poisoning the water supply, civil rights cases that were finally giving minorities a voice in our courts. "So you decided Maria and Tommy's lives were worth less than his convenience?" Kane's face darkened. "I decided that the deaths of 2 teenagers, tragic though they were, didn't justify destroying the career of a man who was literally saving thousands of other lives through his work. You murdered them." "I tried to save them," Kane said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. "I offered them money. I offered them jobs. I offered them anything they wanted if they would just keep quiet for 2 years until Wells retired. But they wouldn't listen. Because they believed in justice, because they were children who thought the world was a fairy tale." Kane pulled a tarnished sheriff's badge from his pocket, turning it over in his weathered hands. "Do you know what I've done with my life, Evelyn? I've served this community for 50 years. I've put away murderers and rapists and drug dealers. I've protected families and saved lives and made the world a little bit safer for decent people. And you've covered up crimes when it suited your purposes. I've made hard choices that children like Maria and Tommy were too naive to understand." The badge caught the afternoon sunlight, and Evelyn could see how worn it was. How many years? Kane had carried it like a talisman or a burden. She thought about her own 40 years of service, her dedication to healing and helping others, and wondered how many compromises she had made along the way that she had justified to herself as necessary. "What do you want from me now?" she asked. "I want you to convince your friend in room 314 to stop digging up the past. Wells is dying. He'll be dead within 6 months. When he's gone, this all becomes ancient history. No one gets hurt, no families get destroyed, no good work gets undone. And if I refuse?" Kane stood up slowly, tucking the badge back into his pocket. Then I'll have to assume you've learned nothing from what happened to your friends. And that would be a shame, because I've always thought you were smarter than them. He walked back toward his car, leaving Evelyn sitting on the bench with the weight of 50 years of silence pressing down on her shoulders. Through the hospital windows above, she could see David Chen watching, waiting to learn whether she would finally find the courage that had eluded her for half a century. Evelyn returned to room 314 with her mind reeling from Kane's revelations. David Chen was sitting up in bed, his face tense with worry and anticipation. She closed the door behind her and pulled the visitor's chair close to his bedside. "What did he want?" David asked. "To convince me to stop digging into the past, to make me believe that your brother and Maria died for the greater good." Evelyn's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she reached for the folder of evidence. David had shown her earlier. "He told me about Judge Wells, about how important he was to the community." "Wells." David's face went pale. "Harrison Wells, you know the name." "Know it?" David laughed bitterly. "Evelyn, Judge Wells wasn't just the man who killed that family in the hit and run. He was the judge who presided over the investigation into Tommy and Maria's deaths. He ruled their deaths accidental. He sealed the case file and made sure no further investigation would ever take place." The folder slipped from Evelyn's hands again, papers scattering across the hospital floor. "That's impossible. Kane said Wells was the victim, not the perpetrator. Kane lied to you, just like he's been lying for 50 years. David reached into his bedside drawer and pulled out another document, this one bearing official letterhead. "This is Wells's death certificate. He died 3 months ago, Evelyn. Lung cancer. Kane couldn't have been protecting him. He's already dead." Evelyn stared at the death certificate, her mind struggling to process this new information. Then why? Because Kane wasn't protecting Wells. He was protecting himself. David's voice was grim. Kane wasn't just the deputy who covered up the hit and run. He was Wells' partner in it. "What do you mean?" David pulled himself higher in the bed, wincing from the movement. "I've spent 40 years investigating this case, Evelyn. I've tracked down witnesses, studied police reports, followed money trails. Kane and Wells weren't just colleagues. They were business partners." He handed her a manila envelope she hadn't seen before. "Open it." Inside were bank records, real estate documents, and incorporation papers dating back to the early 1970s. The names Douglas Kane and Harrison Wells appeared together on multiple documents, including the deed to a large tract of land outside Cedar Falls and the incorporation papers for a development company. They were buying up farmland around Cedar Falls, David explained, cheap land from farmers who were struggling to make ends meet. The plan was to develop it into a shopping center and residential subdivision once the new highway came through. What does this have to do with the hit and run? The family that was killed, the Hendersons, they owned the largest farm in the area, 200 acres right in the path of the proposed development. They had refused multiple offers to sell, said the land had been in their family for 4 generations and they'd never give it up. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. So Kane and Wells killed them for their land? Not intentionally at first. I think the hit and run really was an accident. Wells was driving back from a meeting with potential investors, probably drinking. His medical records show he had a serious alcohol problem. But when he hit the Henderson family's car and realized what he'd done, he panicked and called Kane. David pointed to one of the documents. "Look at this, a quit-claim deed signed by Mrs. Henderson's sister just 2 weeks after the funeral. She inherited the farm and immediately sold it to Kane and Wells for a fraction of its value. They pressured her into selling, or threatened her. The sister moved to California right after the sale and never came back to Cedar Falls. I tried to contact her for my investigation, but she died in 1995. Car accident, just like her sister's family." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, creating a picture far more sinister than Evelyn had imagined. Tommy and Maria weren't just witnesses to a hit and run, they were witnesses to the beginning of a conspiracy. And when they went, To Kane, with what they'd seen, he realized they could destroy not just Wells' career, but their entire business partnership, millions of dollars in potential profits. But why didn't he just pay them off? Kane told me he offered them money. David's expression grew even grimmer. Because Tommy and Maria had taken those photographs, they had actual evidence of Wells at the scene, evidence of Kane directing the cover-up, evidence of the second car. Money wouldn't have been enough. They needed complete silence. Evelyn thought about Maria's diary, about the warning note telling her to get out of town. Someone tried to save them. I think so too. And I think I know who. David reached for his bedside table one more time, pulling out a small tape recorder, the kind that had been common in the 1970s. This was in Tommy's car when they pulled it from Miller's Creek. The police never mentioned it in their report, but one of the rescue workers kept it all these years. He gave it to me last year when he was dying of cancer. What's on it? Listen. For yourself. David pressed play, and after a moment of static, voices emerged from the small speaker, young voices, frightened but determined. Can't let them get away with this, Tommy. Those children died because of what that man did. It was Maria's voice, clear and strong despite the crackling of the old recording. I know, but Evelyn is right to be scared. If Kane is involved in covering this up, who knows how far they'll go to keep us quiet. Tommy's voice, measured and thoughtful even in crisis. Miguel saw us at the sheriff's office today. He followed us there because he was worried about Maria. If something happens to us, he'll know. The recording cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of screeching tires and breaking glass. Evelyn sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Miguel knew. All these years he's known exactly what happened. More than that, David said. I think Miguel has been protecting the evidence all along. The photographs, the diary, this tape recording. He's been keeping it all safe, waiting for the right moment to use it. But why wait 50 years? Because he was waiting for you. The words hung in the air between them. Evelyn thought about her conversation with Miguel in the cemetery, about the way he had spoken about Maria's faith in her eventual courage. I need to call him, she said, reaching for her phone. No, David caught her hand. Kane is probably monitoring your calls by now. We need to assume he knows about Miguel, about the evidence, about everything. Then what do we do? Before David could answer, there was another knock on the door. This time it was Dr. Chen, and her expression was troubled. Evelyn, I need to speak with you privately. There's been a development. They stepped into the hallway, where Sarah lowered her voice to a whisper. Hospital security just informed me that there's been a break-in at the records office. Someone accessed our patient database and printed out information about John Doe. They also pulled his medical files. When did this happen? Last night after midnight. Security cameras show an elderly man who apparently had legitimate credentials. He identified himself as a retired law enforcement officer conducting a welfare check. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Douglas Kane. You know him? He's the reason. David Chen is in that room with those wounds. Sarah, we need to get David out of here, tonight. I can't discharge a patient based on... He's not safe here. None of us are safe as long as Kane knows where to find him. Dr. Chen studied Evelyn's face, seeing something there that made her decision for her. I'll prepare a transfer order, she said. We'll move him to the county hospital under a different name. But Evelyn, you need to tell me what's really going on here. 50 years ago, I was a coward when my friends needed me to be brave. I won't make that mistake again. As Dr. Chen hurried away to arrange the transfer, Evelyn realized that the careful life she had built was about to be destroyed. But for the first time in decades, that didn't terrify her. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced since. That terrible summer when she was 22 years old, she felt ready to fight. The transfer to County General was scheduled for midnight, when the hospital corridors would be quieter and there would be fewer witnesses to David Chen's departure. Dr. Chen had arranged for an ambulance crew she trusted personally, and David would be admitted under the name John Martinez, a construction worker recovering from injuries sustained in a fall. But as evening settled over Mercy General, Evelyn began to feel that familiar tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her age or the stress of the day. It was the same feeling she had experienced 50 years ago, the sense that events were moving beyond her control toward an inevitable confrontation. She had spent the afternoon making careful preparations. In her apartment, she had recorded a detailed audio testimony on her old cassette recorder, the same model David had played for her earlier. She documented everything she remembered about that summer in 1973, everything Miguel had shown her, everything David had revealed about Kane and Wells' conspiracy. She made 3 copies of the tape and hid them in different locations, one with Dr. Chen, one in a safety deposit box at her bank, and one in a package addressed to Miguel Santos, that she had mailed that afternoon. "If something happens to me," she had told Sarah, "make sure that tape gets to the FBI." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Sarah had replied, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Now, as she sat beside David's bed in the dimly lit room, Evelyn felt the weight of 50 years of silence pressing down on her shoulders. David had been growing weaker throughout the day, the stress of the revelations taking a toll on his already frail body. The carved names on his arms seemed to stand out more starkly in the lamplight, a permanent reminder of all the people who had paid the price for Kane's version of justice. "Tell me about Tommy," she said softly. "What was he like as a little boy?" David's eyes softened as he spoke about his older brother. "Tommy was the kind of person who couldn't walk past an injured animal without stopping to help. When I was 6, I found a bird with a broken wing in our backyard. Tommy spent 3 weeks nursing it back to health, feeding it with an eyedropper, building it a little nest in a shoebox. When it was strong enough to fly again, we took it outside and watched it soar away. He sounds like Maria. She was always bringing home strays, cats, dogs, even a raccoon once that had been hit by a car. They were good people," David said, "the kind of people the world needs more of. That's why what happened to them was so wrong. It wasn't just 2 lives that were lost. It was all the good they would have done, all the people they would have helped." "David, I need to ask you something. The wounds on your arms, how did they really happen?" David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously tracing the bandages that covered the carved names. "Kane didn't just threaten me when I got too close to the truth. 3 months ago, he had me kidnapped, held me in an old barn outside of town for 2 days while he tried to convince me to stop my investigation. He tortured you. He carved those names himself, said it was a reminder of what happens to people who don't know when to quit. Said if I didn't stop digging into the past, I'd end up just like them." Evelyn felt a surge of rage that surprised her with its intensity. "How did you escape?" "I didn't. He let me go, but not before he made sure I understood the message. Every name on my arms represents someone who got too close to the truth. Some of them died in accidents. Others just disappeared. A few got smart and left town before anything. You could happen to them. But you didn't leave. I couldn't. Tommy was my brother. Someone had to speak for him." The conviction in David's voice reminded Evelyn painfully of the conversation she had had with Maria and Tommy 50 years ago, when they had decided to go to the police despite the risks. She had abandoned them then, let her fear overcome her sense of justice, but she wouldn't make that mistake again. "Kane is going to try to stop the transfer tonight," she said. "He knows we're moving you, and he knows this might be his last chance to silence you permanently. I know, I've been expecting it. Then why haven't you contacted the FBI? Why haven't you turned over all your evidence to federal authorities?" David smiled sadly. "Because for 40 years I've been a man obsessed with solving his brother's murder. Who's going to believe the word of someone like that against a respected former sheriff? Kane has spent decades building his reputation, cultivating relationships with law enforcement agencies across the state. He has friends in high places who would vouch for his character. But the evidence, circumstantial at best. Bank records that prove a business partnership. Photographs that could be interpreted multiple ways. Testimony from witnesses who are either dead or too scared to talk. Kane has been very careful to make sure there's nothing that would stand up in court. So what's the point of all this? Why are we putting ourselves at risk if we can't actually bring him to justice? Because sometimes doing the right thing isn't about winning. Sometimes it's just about making sure the truth gets told, even if no one wants to hear it. The hospital grew quieter as visiting hours ended and the evening shift settled into their routines. Evelyn could hear the familiar sounds of the night, monitors beeping, soft conversations at the nurse's station, the distant rumble of the elevator carrying staff between floors. But underneath those familiar noises, she sensed something else. A tension in the air, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. At 11 o'clock, Marcus Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "The ambulance crew is here," he said quietly. "Dr. Chen wants to start the transfer early." "Why?" Evelyn asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Security spotted someone in the parking lot who's been there since this afternoon. Elderly man in a dark sedan. He's just sitting there watching the hospital." Evelyn and David exchanged glances. Kane wasn't even trying to hide his presence anymore. He was making it clear that he knew exactly what they were planning. "We need to use a different exit," Evelyn said. "The loading dock on the south side. Kane will be watching the main entrance." "Already thought of that," Marcus replied. "Dr. Chen has it covered." As they prepared David for transport, transferring him from the hospital bed to a wheelchair that would take him to the service elevator, Evelyn felt the familiar flutter of fear in her chest. But this time, instead of letting it paralyze her, she used it to sharpen her focus. "David," she said, as Marcus stepped out to coordinate with the ambulance crew, "I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, your brother would be proud of you. You've spent your whole life seeking justice for him. That takes a kind of courage most people never find. And Maria would be proud of you too," David replied. "It took 50 years, but you finally found your courage." The transfer went smoothly at first. Marcus wheeled David down the service corridor while Evelyn walked beside them, carrying the folder of evidence and her own small bag. The service elevator was empty, and they made their way to the loading dock without encountering anyone except a janitor who nodded politely as they passed. But as the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Evelyn heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of police sirens in the distance, growing closer. "That's not good," Marcus said, checking his watch. The ambulance crew didn't call for backup. They emerged from the elevator to find the loading dock empty. The ambulance that should have been waiting for them was nowhere to be seen. "Where are they?" Evelyn asked, but even as she spoke, she saw a familiar figure emerge from the shadows beside the loading dock. Douglas Kane stepped into the light, and he was no longer alone. 2 men in dark clothing flanked him, and all 3 were armed. "Hello, Evelyn," Kane said calmly. "I think it's time we finished our conversation." The loading dock felt like a trap that had been 50 years in the making. Kane's 2 companions positioned themselves to block any escape routes, while the distant sound of sirens grew closer. Evelyn realized with sinking clarity that Kane had orchestrated this entire confrontation, probably calling in some fabricated emergency to draw police resources away from the hospital. "Where's the ambulance crew?" Marcus demanded, his hand moving protectively to David's wheelchair. "They received a call about a multi-car accident on the interstate," Kane replied smoothly. "Terrible thing. Fortunately, I was nearby and offered to help with the transfer." "You can't just take him," Evelyn said, stepping between Kane and David's wheelchair. "This is a hospital. There are witnesses, security cameras." "Are there?" Kane gestured toward the loading dock security camera, which hung at an odd angle with its lens clearly damaged. "Amazing how often these old systems malfunction. And as for witnesses, well, I think Mr. Rodriguez understands the value of discretion." Marcus's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "I'm calling hospital security." "I wouldn't recommend." "In that," one of Kane's companions said quietly, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal a shoulder holster. The pieces of Kane's plan were becoming clear to Evelyn. He had isolated them in the most remote part of the hospital, disabled the security system, and created a cover story that would explain David's disappearance. Whatever happened next, it would look like an unfortunate accident or a case of a confused elderly patient wandering off during a transfer. "What do you want, Kane?" David spoke for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice weak but defiant. "I want this to end," Kane replied. 50 years is long enough for everyone to carry the burden of that summer. It's time to let the dead rest in peace. The dead can't rest in peace when their killers are still walking free. Kane's expression hardened. "I never killed anyone, David. Your brother and Maria Santos died in a car accident. Judge Wells died of cancer 3 months ago. The Henderson family died in a tragic hit-and-run that was never solved. Those are the official records, and that's how history will remember these events." "History built on lies," Evelyn said. "History built on necessary compromises," Kane corrected. "You think you're fighting for justice, but you have no idea what justice really costs. Wells and I prevented a drug ring from poisoning 3 counties with heroin. We stopped a chemical company from dumping toxic waste into the water supply. We put away rapists and murderers and child molesters. That's our legacy, built on the graves of innocent people, built on hard choices that children like you could never understand." Kane reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "This contains every piece of evidence you've collected over the years, David. Every photograph, every document, every witness statement. It also contains a confession, written in your handwriting, explaining how grief over your brothers' death drove you to fabricate evidence and make false accusations against respected members of the community." "I'll never sign that." "You don't have to sign it. We found samples of your handwriting from various sources over the years. Modern technology makes it quite easy to replicate someone's signature and writing style." The coldness in Kane's voice sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. This wasn't the desperate act of a man trying to cover up past crimes. This was the methodical planning of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear. "The confession will be found in your apartment after your suicide," Kane continued matter-of-factly. "A lonely old man, consumed by paranoid delusions about his brother's death, finally decides to end his suffering. Very tragic, but not entirely unexpected given your history of mental instability." "What mental instability?" Marcus asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "Oh, David has been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years," Kane said. "Diagnosed with various conditions related to his obsession with his brother's death. The medical records are quite detailed." David's face went ashen. "You've been manufacturing evidence against me. I've been preparing for this day since you started your investigation 40 years ago. Did you really think I would let you destroy everything I've built based on the delusions of a grief-stricken child?" Kane gestured to his companions, who began moving toward David's wheelchair. But as they did, Evelyn made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of stepping aside or pleading for mercy, she grabbed the wheelchair's handles and began pushing David toward the loading dock's exit. "Run!" she shouted to Marcus, who immediately understood and began clearing a path. Kane's voice followed them as they rushed toward the hospital's main building. "You can't run forever, Evelyn, just like your friends couldn't run from the truth 50 years ago." But they were already through the doors, racing down the corridor toward the safety of the main hospital, where witnesses and security cameras might provide protection. Behind them, Evelyn could hear Kane's footsteps, but she also heard something else, the sound of sirens that were finally growing closer rather than fading away. Someone had called for real help. They burst through the doors into the main hospital corridor, where the late-night calm was suddenly shattered by their desperate flight. Dr. Chen appeared from around a corner, drawn by the commotion, and immediately grasped the situation. "Security!" she called out, her voice echoing through the hallway. "Lock down all exits!" Behind them, Kane and his men had given up any pretense of subtlety. They pursued openly now, their footsteps heavy on the polished floor. But the hospital was no longer the isolated loading dock. Here there were witnesses, staff members, and most importantly, the security protocols that Dr. Chen had just activated. Evelyn pushed David's wheelchair toward the elevator bank, her heart pounding with exertion and adrenaline. Marcus ran beside them, speaking rapidly into his radio to coordinate with hospital security. The elevator doors opened just as Kane rounded the corner behind them, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Hold those doors!" Kane shouted, but Dr. Chen stepped between him and the elevator. "I'm sorry, sir, but visiting hours are over. You'll need to leave the hospital immediately." "I'm a police officer," Kane snarled, reaching for his jacket. "Former police officer," Dr. Chen corrected coolly, "and unless you have a warrant, you have no authority here." The elevator doors closed, carrying Evelyn and David upward toward the third floor. In the enclosed space, David was breathing heavily, his face pale with exhaustion and pain. "Where are we going?" he asked. "The chapel," Evelyn replied. "It's the most secure room in the hospital, and there's a phone there that connects directly to the police." The chapel at Mercy General was a small interfaith space that served patients and families of all religious backgrounds. It was located at the end of a corridor that had only one entrance, making it easy to secure. More importantly, Evelyn remembered that Father Rodriguez, no relation to Marcus, kept emergency supplies there, including a landline phone that bypassed the hospital's main switchboard. They reached the chapel as the sound of sirens finally reached the hospital parking lot. Through the small windows, Evelyn could see police cars arriving, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. But she also saw Kane's dark sedan racing away from the scene, suggesting that at least some of his plan had failed. David transferred himself from the wheelchair to one of the chapel's wooden pews, his movements slow and painful. The carved names on his arms were visible beneath his hospital gown, and in the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, they looked like a memorial to all the victims of Kane's twisted version of justice. "We need to call Miguel," Evelyn said, reaching for the chapel's phone. "He needs to know what's happening." But as she lifted the receiver, David caught her wrist. "Wait," he said. "Before you make that call, there's something else you need to know." "What?" "Miguel isn't the only one who's been keeping evidence safe all these years. There's someone else, someone who's been waiting for the right moment to come forward." Evelyn felt a chill of premonition. "Who?" "Judge Wells's daughter. She's been living with the knowledge of what her father did for 50 years. When he was dying, he confessed everything to her, the hit and run, the cover-up, the murders of your friends. She has his written confession, along with documents that prove Kane was his partner in the land development scheme." "Why hasn't she come forward before now?" "Because Kane has been threatening her family for decades. But Wells's death changed things. She no longer feels bound by her father's crimes, and she's ready to testify." As if summoned by their conversation, the chapel door opened. Evelyn turned, expecting to see hospital security or police officers. Instead, she saw an elderly woman in her 70s, with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of decades of secret knowledge. "Miss Matthews," the woman said quietly, "my name is Catherine Wells Morrison. I believe you knew my father." Evelyn's hands began to shake as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. "You're the one who's been helping David with his investigation. I've been helping him for 20 years, ever since he first contacted me. My father destroyed so many lives, and I've spent my entire adult life trying to find a way to make amends." Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope similar to the one Kane had shown them earlier. But this envelope bore an official seal and the letterhead of a law firm. "This is my father's complete confession, notarized and witnessed by 3 attorneys. It details everything: the hit and run, the cover-up, Kane's role in murdering your friends, and the pattern of intimidation and violence that followed." I've also provided financial records that show how they profited from the Henderson family's deaths." "Why now?" Evelyn asked. "Why are you finally coming forward?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Because this morning I learned that Kane is planning to retire next month. He's moving to Florida, where he'll spend his remaining years enjoying the money he made from blood. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him escape justice again." Outside the chapel, they could hear voices in the corridor, police officers coordinating with hospital security, medical staff dealing with the disruption, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of Kane's arrest as he was finally caught trying to flee the scene. For the first time in 50 years, the truth was about to see daylight. 6 months later, Evelyn stood in the autumn sunshine outside Cedar Falls High School, watching workers install a bronze memorial plaque near the main entrance. The plaque bore the names of Maria Santos and Thomas Chen, along with the inscription, "In memory of two young people who believed that truth and justice were worth any sacrifice." The trial of Douglas Kane had made headlines across the state. His conviction on charges of murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice had shocked many who remembered him as a respected law enforcement officer. But for Evelyn, David, Miguel, and Catherine Wells Morrison, the verdict had brought something more precious than vindication. It had brought peace. Kane had been sentenced to life in prison, where he would spend his remaining years among the criminals he had once claimed to protect society from. The irony was not lost on anyone who had followed the case. Judge Wells's posthumous confession had been the key piece of evidence, corroborated by David's 40 years of investigation and Catherine's financial records. The truth that had been buried for 5 decades had finally seen the light of day. David Chen stood beside Evelyn, his health much improved now that the burden of his quest for justice had been lifted. The carved names on his arms were healing, but he had decided not to have them surgically removed. They would remain as a permanent memorial to his brother and all the other victims of Kane's crimes. "Tommy would have liked this," he said, gesturing toward the memorial plaque. "He always believed that good things would happen if you just had the patience to wait for them." "Maria too," Evelyn replied. "She used to say that the truth was like a seed. It might take a long time to grow, but eventually it would break through even the hardest ground." Miguel Santos approached them, wearing his clerical collar and carrying a small bouquet of yellow roses, Maria's favorite flowers. Over the past 6 months, he had become not just a spiritual guide for Evelyn, but a genuine friend. Their shared memories of that terrible summer had created a bond that transcended the years of separation. "The dedication ceremony went well," he said, joining them in front of the memorial. "The principal said they're going to establish a scholarship in Maria and Tommy's names for students who want to study criminal justice or social work." "They would have loved that," Evelyn said. Catherine Wells Morrison had also attended the dedication, though she had kept a low profile. Her decision to come forward with her father's confession had cost her dearly. Many members of the community still saw her as a traitor who had destroyed the reputation of a respected judge. But she had told Evelyn privately that she finally slept peacefully at night for the first time in decades. The memorial garden behind the high school was small but beautifully maintained, with benches where students could sit and reflect. A plaque near the entrance explained that the garden was dedicated to the principle that truth and justice were worth pursuing, no matter how long it took or how difficult the journey became. Evelyn had retired from nursing 2 months after Kane's arrest. Her 40 years of service had ended not with a quiet farewell, but with the recognition that she had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. Dr. Chen had organized a retirement party that was attended by dozens of former patients and colleagues, but the gift that meant the most to Evelyn was a simple card from David Chen that read, "Thank you for helping me find my brother's voice." She had begun volunteering with a victim advocacy group, using her medical background and hard-won wisdom to help families navigate the criminal justice system. The work was difficult and sometimes heartbreaking, but it gave her a sense of purpose that she had never found in her carefully constructed life of anonymity. "I've been thinking about something," David said as they walked through the memorial garden. "About what happens next." "What do you mean?" "Cain wasn't the only corrupt official in this state. There are other cases, other cover-ups, other families who never got justice. Maybe it's time to start investigating some of those too." Evelyn considered this. At 67, she was probably too old to begin a new career as an investigator. But the thought of using the skills she had developed, the patience, the attention to detail, the ability to listen to people's stories without judgment, to help other families find answers, was appealing. "Are you suggesting we become partners?" she asked. "I'm suggesting we finish what Tommy and Maria started 50 years ago. They believed that ordinary people could make a difference if they had the courage to stand up for what was right. Maybe it's time to prove them correct." Miguel smiled as he listened to their conversation. "Maria always said that the three of you would change the world someday. I think she was right. It just took longer than she expected." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the memorial garden, Evelyn felt something she had not experienced in 50 years. She felt at peace with her past and excited about her future. The girl who had run away from courage in 1973 had finally grown into the woman her friends had always believed she could become. She placed her own bouquet of flowers at the base of the memorial plaque, yellow roses for Maria and white carnations for Tommy. The bronze letters of their names caught the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment, Evelyn could almost hear their voices carried on the autumn wind, young and hopeful and eternally committed to the belief that truth would always triumph over lies, no matter how long the struggle took. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, but some truths were worth a lifetime of courage to uncover. Finally, after 50 years of silence, Evelyn Matthews had learned the difference.